and Derek and Amelia as well for this overall seminar series, which looks like it's been fascinating, and it's great to be here today. We wanted to take the opportunity to share with you this presentation, which is part of a broader project that we're going to tell you a little bit more about, in which we are exploring experiences of what, Amelia, you were just alluding to, this process of becoming a citizen in the UK. And I don't know how familiar people are with it before we get into the specifics of the research aims and objectives, but this is the process whereby in order to become a citizen in this country since 2005, you need to demonstrate sufficient proficiency in English, among other languages, and you need to pass a test demonstrating your knowledge of life in the UK. And of course that's changed over time, it's become increasingly difficult, and there's lots more to say about that, but that's the broader context. And the project that we're doing then is a project funded by the ESRC to explore migrants' experiences of that process. So people have been talking a bit today about top-down and bottom-up. It doesn't always completely hold, but it's about understanding this idea of lived experience, rooted in people's meanings, interpretations. So it's taking that policy instrument and the kind of space around it and understanding how people interpret and negotiate that, what kind of sense they make of that, how it influences them, but also in turn what their strategies and responses are. And this is adding to a growing literature that Anne-Marie Fortier and Bridget Byrne and others have been developing around those kinds of experiences, that understanding from the inside of how people are engaging with that process and what it means to them. Our broader study, which we're not going to get a chance to say too much about today, is a mixed method study where we're looking at experiences of the process itself, but also its consequences in terms of political participation, in terms of sense of belonging and well-being. And we're happy to say more about that aspect after if there's time. So really then the point to insist on then is it's about the policy instrument itself, but it's that interface, that insertion of the policy process into daily life that gives scope to reflect on the instrument in and of itself, but more broadly on lived experience, on meaning and on negotiation.
Okay, so as Leah just said, this is really much in the framework of this broader process project that we have been looking at the Brexit context. Really much when we think about the way we came to this issue of Brexit, we've been forced into Brexit, like all of us, I guess, while we were doing our field work. And this is why we decided to look a little bit further into this issue. So this is our presentation today. We will talk a little bit about our theoretical framework, try to explain a little bit about our methods, and then present some of our first findings. Just to say that this is really much work in progress, so we'll appreciate your feedback and questions. So this is an attempt to sketch somehow our theoretical framework in relation to this Brexit context. What we wanted to do, this is our broad question, is to look at the strategic reaction of one group of migrants in particular, Eastern European EU migrants, and mostly Polish people we interviewed. So the strategic reaction to the Brexit context. And to understand this reaction, we somehow used two notions. And these are the notions of respectability, looking at the work of Beverly Skeggs, and the notion of dignity, looking at the work of, mostly the recent work of Michel Lamont. These are different cases and different approaches on which these two researchers have worked, but there is somehow a broad general idea that we want to use with these two notions. The general idea is that we are talking about a strategic reaction to a situation of uncertainties, uncertainties in relation to someone's position in society when it's not clearly defined, and a strategic reaction to a situation of stigmatization. This is the recent work of Michel Lamont. And if we think about these two dimensions, uncertainties and stigmatization, we the way we look and we think about it, well, the Brexit context is specifically about this. It's a situation of uncertainties for the migrants we observed, uncertainties about residence status, about access to jobs and services, and it's a situation of stigmatization. We don't have to come back to the racist events and the general discourses in the framework in the context of the Brexit. So we use these two notions, respectability and dignity, as ways to understand the discursive strategies that aim to signify and somehow protect, defend one's own position in society. So our argument, our general argument, and again this is really much something we're testing today, is that these strategies of respectability and dignity are going to lead many migrants we interviewed, going to lead them to construct boundaries. And these boundaries we observe are racial and ethnic boundaries, but also class boundaries, and at a broader level maybe, boundaries in terms of values and ethos. We found some boundaries in terms of the values of normality and the values of cosmopolitanism. So this is what we're going to try to look into, to present today, and just to say that these strategies also are socially situated. They relate to the specific mobility strategy, migration trajectories of the migrants we interviewed, and also they relate to the experience in the job market in the UK.
So in terms of the broader study, and that this is just a fraction of, I mean, we did speak to a large number of migrants, and you can see here we're talking about a cross-section of nationalities. Overall, there are 39 nationalities represented in our sample, so we're really talking to just about a small portion there. And the reason I emphasize that point is also to pick up on the conversation we were having before, because of these kind of broader histories and realities around race and race hierarchy and race privilege. Because thinking about these different aspects of the process, we talk to people at all of those different stages in the process, whether considering, refusing, preparing, etc., all of which are very much inflected by hierarchies of race and nationality. Refusing, for instance, we might think of EU migrants who until now have been in a position to say, well, I just won't engage with that. But that also includes people who have decided perhaps to go off the grid, to overstay, or to become undocumented. And the degrees of fear and anxiety here are often quite closely calibrated around those kinds of hierarchies. And it's very, very important that we remember this. Also, in terms of some of the things, Amelia, you were just talking about onus being on migrants and onus to prove. And in the broader sample, there's some very important examples about fear and anxiety around the mechanics of the process. For instance, the need to demonstrate good character. Well, what does that mean? Who's deciding what that means? And the implications of demonstrating good character are quite different depending on nationality and on race. We've done a lot of dissemination of this work now to different groups of migrants and of organizations and migrant-led organizations. When we talk about good character to groups that are frankly not EU and not white, you feel such a fear in the room because many people we're disseminating the results to are in both of those groups and actually are really, really worried about what is going to happen in terms of what will deem to be bad character, being late on council tax or something like this. So it's really important just to emphasize that broader context. Now, what we're talking about today, we're drawing on phase 1 and phase 2. In the second phase, the first phase was just a general cross-section of nationalities. In phase 2, we focused on what we called communities, with all of the pitfalls that implies. And one of the groups that we focused on was Polish migrants. And that was all sort of chugging along nicely until, as Pierre said, and as we all know, we got forced into this Brexit context. And we thought this would be a really important opportunity to take advantage of that research underway and to set up some more Brexit-focused focus groups that we conducted right before the referendum and then in the months following. So we conducted 4 focus groups with Eastern European EU migrants, and really talking about the general themes of citizenship, the mechanics of naturalization, British citizenship more generally, and a lot of the sort of strategic issues around, well, what happens now? How do people relate to the policy instrument itself? And how do people relate to the idea of British citizenship more broadly? So in terms of the numbers then, I mean, the individual interviews, as we were saying, were primarily Polish, and then within the focus groups, there was a broader range of nationalities, which we can go into more detail about.
So I was talking briefly about the social situation of the migrants we interviewed, and again we're focusing here on the Eastern European EU migrants, mostly Polish migrants we interviewed. If we look at the literature on Polish migrants and Eastern European migrants living in the UK, we are talking about a migration which is circular and temporary, and which is related specifically in the UK to a very flexible kind of labour market. So the UK opened its borders to Polish migrants in 2004. This was one of the only countries in the European Union to do so. And the Eastern-Western migration pattern tended to look like this. From our data, again, from the interviews and the focus groups that we did, we have a sort of constructing migration pattern. Many of the migrants we interviewed related to this specific pattern. So they were here for a couple of years, worked in a very flexible labor market, and they were keen to show it. They were keen to show that they presented themselves as highly flexible, and they didn't have any plan to settle in the UK. So doing the citizenship test, for example, wasn't really a priority for them. But we also have a part of our interviewees and a part of our participants in the focus groups who have plans to settle in the UK. They consider to take the Life in the UK test. Very few of them actually did, but they are in the process of considering it. And the main motivation for them to stay in the UK is about their children. So it's about a sort of investment in the future. This is the kind of vocabulary that they use. In terms of their situation in the labor market, here we have also very interesting constructing findings. Most of the participants in our study talked about feelings of devaluation, saying that their skills, their training in their country of origin wasn't recognized in the UK, and that they are somehow limited to low-skilled jobs. So this confirms, again, a part of the literature on this issue. But we also, in a sort of paradox maybe, we also find many respondents, and sometimes the same people who say that they have these feelings of devaluation, who say the UK gives me also many opportunities. It's an opportunity to work here in the UK. It's related to this form of investment in the future I was talking about. So they express the idea that their education skills are not fully recognized, but also they have some, they express their desire for upwards mobility, social mobility, and claim that they will achieve it. So now we're looking a little bit at the types of boundaries I mentioned before, and we put some quotations here just to give you a flavor of what we observe. So we try to illustrate these discursive strategies of respectability and dignity with these kind of quotations. This example here is specifically about ethnicity, as you will see, and specifically about the citizenship test. But what we observe in our fieldwork is that the kind of ID which is expressed here is much broader than simply about the citizenship test. It's a boundary which is constructed between themselves and other groups that they claim don't want to integrate. So these are their words here. So their strategies of respectability and dignity are constructed through these symbolic boundaries with other ethnic groups, and also what they consider to be, we'll come to this in a minute, markers of lower social classes. They argue that some ethnic groups don't want to integrate, don't want to learn English, and they reproduce many stereotypes about, for example, people living on benefits. They claim being lazy, for example. These strategies relate to their position in the labor markets as well as to their migration trajectories. They construct these boundaries and they assert their respectable position through the idea that they are hardworking, that they do the work that other people don't want to do. Formulate somehow performing a very neoliberal kind of citizenship. They also express the idea that their own migration trajectory to the UK is a sign of their adventurous and mobile set of mind, which would be different from other groups migrating to the UK. What emerges at a broader level, I think, from this fieldwork, is that they underline that becoming a British citizen is maybe not a necessity for them. They imply the idea that the debates about immigration and integration and the debates about Brexit more generally do not concern their group in particular, but they concern other groups of migrants. So here we talked about sense of entitlements before. Well, this is precisely what we observe here.
Yeah, I think Pierre's covered some of these points, so I won't go over them in too much detail in the interest of time, but really here it's, as Pierre was suggesting, this idea of people mirroring, perhaps we were talking about the role of the media earlier, this highly mediatized discourse about benefit culture, about that applying to British people who don't want to work, as well as possibly to compatriots or other migrant communities who may not want to work. So this is a different type of class, but also, I mean, none of these categories or strategies are mutually exclusive. Ethnic and racialized kinds of discourses. I think that the point to add here too, which I think is coming out in other presentations too, and other research, is this kind of moral value around work, around labor, and the good citizen / migrant, and this kind of sacred quality to redemption through labor and through contribution. And of course that connects to a broader literature around deservingness, around neoliberal citizenship that has to be earned. And I just want to draw your attention to that connection, because we should be, all of us, pushing more on that, and we certainly are as we analyze our data. I think the other point really was around these ideas around status and also around normality. And here we see this person making a careful distinction about people are not talking about me based on where I'm from, but based on what I do, this assertion of normality and respectability through professional identity. And I think part of the interesting point here in other transcripts and other focus group data relates to what Pierre was saying about the way normality can be asserted through very detailed descriptions of daily life that distance from ethnic or national community. I have good relations with my neighbors who are British. I do everyday things that are British. And if I were to naturalize, and as Pierre says, not everyone feels an injunction to do so. I mean, we've written about this elsewhere for other nationalities as a kind of interpolation. We've drawn on Althusser to talk about the grip of perhaps the need to naturalize. This is not something that is being described in many of these interviews and much of this focus group data. It's an idea more that, well, if I were to naturalize, that'll basically formalize what's already happened. I'm already acting and living as in a British way. I'm already assimilating or performing these kinds of of values, which is quite interesting. And I think again here there's more to say, and we're thinking more about the politics of race here, the politics of whiteness, the negotiation of possibly creating certain types of boundaries where people are in some very interesting exchanges, and there was by no means consensus around these points, but some very interesting exchanges took place around the issue of hate crime and whether people, for instance, in the focus groups had experienced hate crime. And in some cases, one person would say, well, yes, I've experienced this, that was very difficult and very painful. And others say, well, no, that doesn't concern us. So there's something very interesting going on there for us to explore further around these processes of boundary making.
The last notion we wanted to talk about is this value of cosmopolitanism. This is something that comes very often in the interviews and in the focus groups. People present themselves as having a very cosmopolitan set of mind. They insist on their mobility, they insist on the idea that they like the diversity in the UK. And in many cases, they use strategically this notion of this value of cosmopolitanism as a way, to draw a boundary, a boundary which is really much a social class boundary. They are saying, we are not, even within their own group, we are not like these other Eastern European migrants who come to the UK just to work and don't really want to integrate into British society. We don't really want to have anything to do with these cosmopolitan values. We are different. We show that we belong to something broader than just the Polish community living here in the UK. So again, another sort of class boundary which is drawn on the basis of these cosmopolitan values. So just to conclude briefly, because we are running out of time, I think something which was very important to us in our reflection about these questions is the work by Adrian Favell on Eurostar, elite migrants who come to live in Brussels, Amsterdam, and London. And he's showing me his work that it's a mixed kind of process. These elite migrants use the opportunities of free movement when they arrive in these cities, but very soon in their sort of settlement process, they face everyday nationalism. And this is really much also what we observed in our fieldwork here. They used this freedom of movement and the values that relate to it, so cosmopolitanism, for example, as a way to assert their respectability and as a way to assert somehow their sense of entitlement. But also they are showing, and this is in the context of the Brexit, they are showing that they are aware of this everyday nationalism, for example, discrimination in the job market, and that they try to cope with it. And one of the ways they cope with it is with this strategy of boundary drawing. So just to say, the work by Adrian Favell has been really interesting to us, and maybe it's not just about elite migrants and the kind of processes we're looking at, but also about migration, intra-European migration more generally. Okay.